The stagecoach bucked and swayed, each lurch a fresh assault on Ilara's already weary bones. Dust, fine as sifted flour, coated her dark traveling dress and settled in the creases around her eyes. She was 48, a fact advertised not by her spirit, which still held a spark of stubborn fire, but by the silver threads that generously wove through her dark brown hair, pulled back in a severe but practical bun. Her advertisement had been honest about her age. A detailed Josiah Thorne, her correspondent and soon-to-be husband, had not objected to in his terse, infrequent letters. Redemption Gulch. The name, scrawled on a weathered signpost they'd passed a mile back, felt like a cruel jest. What redemption could be found in a place that sounded like it had already judged and condemned? The coachman's shout, "End of the line, ma'am," jolted her from her anxious reverie. As Ilara descended, her legs stiff, the air bit with a dry chill that hinted at the plain's unforgiving nature. The town was little more than a single dusty street, flanked by a handful of wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon whose music already leaked into the afternoon, a smithy, and a few nondescript structures. Her gaze, however, was drawn to the small group of women clustered near the store's porch. Their chatter ceased as she stepped down, their eyes sharp and assessing, raking over her. A stout woman with a tight bun and an apron, Mrs. Higgins from the general store, Ilara presumed, nudged her younger companion. "Well, I'll be," the younger one, Clarabelle, with blonde ringlets and a smug set to her lips, whispered, loud enough for Ilara to hear, "Josiah Thorne's bride." Expected a rose, not a thistle with frost on it. A titter ran through the group. Heat, sharp and unwelcome, flooded Ilara's face. Her hands, clasped over her worn valise, tightened. This was it then, the welcome. She'd known, of course, that a mail-order bride, especially one past the bloom of youth, would face scrutiny. But the open derision, the casual cruelty, felt like a physical blow. Her eyes, a deep, steady gray, met Clarabelle's mocking gaze for a brief moment, betraying nothing of the hollowness blooming in her chest. She had endured worse than whispers. She had buried a husband, lost a small bakery to fire, and faced down near destitution. She would not crumble before a gaggle of gossips. A tall, broad-shouldered man detached himself from the shadow of the smithy. His face was weathered, lines etched deep by sun and wind, his dark hair also touched with gray at the temples. His eyes, though, were a startling, clear blue, and they held a kind of weary gravity. Josiah Thorne. He moved with an economy of motion, his worn denim trousers and flannel shirt speaking of hard work, not prosperity. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in her silver-streaked hair, her dust-covered attire, but lingering with no discernible judgment. "Mrs. Mason?" he asked, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder. "Mr. Thorne," Ilara replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It is I." He gave a curt nod. The women on the porch were still watching, their faces alight with mean-spirited curiosity. Josiah seemed oblivious, or perhaps simply accustomed to their attention. "Wagons this way," he said, reaching for her valise. His hand, calloused and strong, brushed hers. A jolt, unexpected and strangely grounding, passed through her. The wagon was old, the horse equally so. As Josiah loaded her trunk, Ilara saw a small face peeking from behind a stack of feed sacks in the general store's doorway. A girl, no more than 10, with wide, watchful eyes. Josiah's eyes. Sarah, his daughter. The child's gaze was as unnervingly direct as her father's, but held a layer of apprehension that tugged at something in Ilara. The ride to the Thorne homestead was mostly silent. The landscape stretched out, vast and indifferent, tawny grasses rolling towards a bruised purple horizon. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, merely occupied by the creak of the wagon wheels and the sigh of the wind. Alara, despite the mockery still stinging her pride, felt a strange sense of calm begin to settle. This land was harsh, yes, but it was honest. It didn't whisper behind its hand. The homestead, when they reached it, was starker than she'd imagined. A small, unpainted cabin, a sturdy-looking barn, and a few struggling corrals. It was clean, meticulously so, but there was an air of things just holding on. Loss and hardship had left their mark here too. Sarah, who had ridden silently beside her father, scrambled down and darted inside without a word, the screen door slamming shut behind her. Josiah's face softened for a fraction of a second. "She's shy," he offered, the explanation sounding like an apology. "Children often are, with strangers," Ilara said, her voice gentle. He led her inside. The cabin was small, 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. Plain, but again, surprisingly clean. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace. Sarah was nowhere to be seen. "Your room," Josiah indicated a narrow door. It was tiny, with a cot and a small window looking out onto the endless prairie. A wave of desolation, sharp and cold as the wind outside, threatened to engulf her. She pushed it down. She had made her choice. "It will do," she said, placing her valise on the cot. Her voice was even. Josiah nodded, his expression unreadable. "Supper's at 6, Sarah helps." He paused, as if searching for more words, then seemed to give up. "I'll be in the barn." Left alone, Ilara sank onto the cot. The silence of the cabin pressed in, broken only by the distant lowing of a cow. The mocking laughter from the town echoed in her ears, a thistle with frost on it. Perhaps they were right. What had she, a woman whose youth was a memory, whose hands were more accustomed to kneading dough than mending fences, to offer this hard man and his silent child in this unforgiving land? Then, a familiar stubbornness stirred within her. She had not come this far to be defeated by whispers or a bleak landscape. She had come for a chance, a last chance perhaps, to build something new from the ashes of her old life. She took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and determination. She would earn her place. Not for them, the gossips in town, but for herself. And perhaps, if the vast, indifferent prairie allowed, for the man and child who now shared her world. The first weeks were a silent, grinding test of endurance. Ilara rose before dawn, the chill of the cabin seeping into her bones, and set about her tasks. Cooking was familiar, though the ingredients were coarse and supplies often meager. She learned to bake bread in the temperamental wood stove, the scent a small comfort in the otherwise stark environment. Cleaning, mending Josiah's worn clothes and Sarah's patched dresses, tending the small, struggling vegetable patch behind the cabin. She did it all with a quiet diligence that Josiah observed, his expression unchanging. Sarah remained a small, wary ghost. She performed her chores with a child's reluctant efficiency, her eyes following Alara's every move, but she rarely spoke directly to her. If Alara asked a question, Sarah would often look to her father, who would answer for her with a brief nod or a word. The rejection, though unspoken, was a constant dull ache. Ilara remembered her own daughter, lost to fever years ago, and the memory made Sarah's distance sharper. Trips to Redemption Gulch for supplies were an ordeal. Martha Higgins, the storekeeper's wife, treated Ilara with a cool civility that was almost worse than open disdain, her questions about Josiah and the farm subtly barbed. Clarabelle, often lingering in the store, would make pointed comments about the hardships of ranch life for delicate older ladies, her gaze flicking meaningfully to Ilara's gray-streaked hair. Ilara learned to meet these encounters with an impassive face, her transactions brief and to the point. Her dignity became her shield, though inside, the remarks chipped away at her resolve like water on stone. One blustery afternoon, Alara found Sarah sitting behind the barn, her face tear-streaked, cradling a rag doll whose arm was nearly torn off. Alara hesitated, then sat down a little way off. "That looks like a well-loved friend," she said softly. Sarah sniffled, clutching the doll tighter. "Her name is Rosie. Papa tried to fix her, but—" Alara held out her hand. "May I see?" Reluctantly, Sarah passed the doll over. The fabric was frayed, the stitching clumsy. "I used to have a little shop," Alara said, her fingers already assessing the damage. "I mended many things. Perhaps I can help Rosie." She took the doll inside, and with thread from her own dwindling supply and a needle that felt like an old friend in her hand, she carefully reattached the arm, reinforcing the worn fabric. When she returned Rosie to Sarah, the girl's eyes, Josiah's clear blue eyes, widened. A tiny, hesitant smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, the first direct words she'd spoken to Alara. It was a small victory, but it warmed Alara more than the struggling fire in the hearth. Another evening, Josiah came in from the barn coughing, a dry, rasping sound that worried Alara. She remembered a patch of horehound and mullein she'd spotted growing wild near the creek, herbs her grandmother had used for chest complaints. The next day, she gathered them, brewing a strong, bitter tea. Josiah looked surprised when she offered it, but he drank it without comment. The following morning, his cough was noticeably eased. He didn't mention it, but Alara saw him glance at the empty mug on the table, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the ice around the Thorne homestead began to thaw. Sarah started asking Alara hesitant questions about the East, about her old life. She even offered to help knead the bread dough one morning, her small hands mimicking Alara's movements. Josiah, too, began to unbend. He started to include Alara in brief discussions about the ranch, a fence that needed mending, a sick calf. His pronouncements were still terse, but they were directed at her, an acknowledgement of her presence, her partnership. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the wind howling like a hungry wolf, they sat by the fire. Sarah, unusually talkative, was describing a hawk she'd seen. Josiah watched her, a rare, gentle expression on his face. He looked at Alara, the firelight catching the silver in her hair. "My Mary, Sarah's mother. She loved birds," he said, his voice quiet. It was the first time he'd spoken her name to Alara. Alara simply nodded, understanding the weight of the admission. "She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was," he affirmed. He fell silent, but the silence was different now, filled with a shared understanding rather than awkwardness. Later, Alara spoke a little of her own late husband, of her small bakery, the smell of yeast and sugar that she sometimes still dreamed of. They were small confidences, carefully offered, tentatively received, but they were building a bridge across the chasm of their separate griefs. The changing seasons brought new challenges. The autumn air grew crisper, the winds sharper. Talk in town was of a hard winter coming, and with the changing season came Jedediah Slocum. He was a portly man with sly eyes and a reputation for coveting his neighbor's land. He owned the sprawling acreage to the north of Thorne's modest ranch. Slocum rode over one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a stray steer, but his eyes kept drifting to the fertile pasture by the creek, a piece of land Josiah prized. "Heard you got yourself a mail order, Thorne," Slocum said, his gaze dismissing Alara where she stood on the porch. "Bit long in the tooth for the kind of work this land demands, ain't she? A man needs a strong young woman to help him prosper." His smile was oily. Josiah's jaw tightened. "My wife is capable, Slocum, and my land ain't for sale." "Everything's for sale, Thorne, for the right price," Slocum sneered, his gaze lingering on Ilara again before he rode off. "Especially when a hard winter's breathing down your neck." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Slocum's words, his blatant disrespect, were a threat, not just to their livelihood, but to the fragile peace they were beginning to build. She saw the worry in Josiah's eyes, a worry he tried to hide but which was palpable in the set of his shoulders. The mockery of the town women was a sting. Slocum was a menace. The first snows came early, dusting the prairie in a thin white sheet. Then, with a sudden vicious fury, the blizzard struck. It descended upon them like a white beast, howling and ravenous, burying the world in a suffocating blanket of snow. The wind shrieked around the corners of the cabin, rattling the shutters, and the temperature plummeted. They were trapped. The drifts piled high against the door. The windows became opaque canvases of frost. For 3 days the storm raged, isolating them completely. Inside, the small cabin became their entire world. Josiah tended the fire, his face grim, rationing their dwindling wood supply. Ilara cooked, her movements economical, conserving their food. Sarah, initially excited by the snow, grew quiet and subdued as the storm wore on, the relentless wind an unnerving soundtrack to their confinement. On the 4th morning, the wind lessened, but the cold intensified, and Sarah woke with a raging fever. Her skin was fiery to the touch, her breathing shallow and rapid. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara. Josiah's face went gray. The nearest doctor was in Redemption Gulch, a full day's ride in good weather, utterly impossible now. "The herbs," Ilara said, her mind racing. "The horehound, the mullein, willow bark for fever." She had dried them, stored them carefully. It was a desperate hope, but it was all they had. For 2 days and nights, Ilara fought for Sarah's life. She coaxed sips of willow bark tea between the girl's cracked lips, sponged her burning forehead with snowmelt, changed her sweat-soaked linens. She sat by the child's cot, murmuring soothing words, her own exhaustion a distant hum beneath the urgency of her task. Josiah paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his usual stoicism shattered by raw fear. He watched Ilara, his blue eyes filled with a desperate dawning awe. He saw not an aging mail-order bride, but a woman of incredible strength, her silver-streaked hair a halo in the dim light, her hands, surprisingly gentle, working with a fierce, unvarying tenderness. On the 3rd night of Sarah's illness, as Ilara dozed fitfully in a chair beside the cot, a new sound cut through the now subsiding wind, the crunch of snow outside, too heavy for a small animal. Her eyes snapped open. Josiah, asleep by the hearth, stirred. Ilara grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace. She peered through a tiny clear patch she'd scraped on the frosted window. A figure, bulky against the snow, was moving towards the barn. Slocum. He must have thought them weakened, perhaps even perished in the storm, and saw an opportunity. A cold fury, sharper than any she'd felt before, surged through Ilara. This was her home now. These were her people. "Josiah," she hissed. He was instantly awake. "Slocum," she whispered, nodding towards the window. Josiah's face hardened. He reached for his rifle, but Ilara was already moving towards the door, poker held ready. "Stay with Sarah," she commanded, her voice low but steel-edged. She wrenched open the door, the icy air hitting her like a fist. Slocum, caught trying to unlatch the barn door, whirled around, surprise on his fleshy face. "Get off this land, Slocum," Ilara's voice rang out, surprisingly powerful in the frozen stillness. The mockery she'd endured, the hardships, her fear for Sarah, it all coalesced into a righteous anger. Slocum's surprise turned into a sneer. "Well, look what we have here. The old woman playing protector, Thorn too sick to defend his own." "He's not sick, and this is our land," Alara stated, taking a step forward, the poker held like a weapon. Just then, Josiah appeared in the doorway behind her, rifle leveled. "You heard my wife, Slocum. Leave, now." Slocum's eyes flickered between Alara's unyielding stance and Josiah's rifle. He saw no easy pickings here, only a united, formidable front. With a curse, he backed away, stumbling in the deep snow, then turned and trudged off into the pre-dawn gloom, his bulk swallowed by the vast white landscape. Alara watched him go, her breath pluming in the frigid air. Then, the adrenaline drained, leaving her trembling. Josiah's hand came to rest on her shoulder, firm and warm. "You were brave, Alara." His voice was rough with emotion. She leaned into his touch for a moment, then straightened. "Sarah?" They rushed back inside. Sarah was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. Alara touched her forehead. The fierce heat had lessened. A weak smile touched Sarah's lips. "Alara?" she whispered. "I'm here, child." Relief, profound and overwhelming, washed over Alara. The storm finally broke the next day, revealing a world transformed, silent, and glistening under a pale sun. Sarah, though weak, was clearly on the mend. Josiah, his face etched with exhaustion but also a new profound respect, couldn't take his eyes off Alara. He watched her as she moved about the cabin, tending to Sarah, preparing a thin broth. He saw the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the silver in her hair that now seemed to shine with an inner light. Later that day, as Sarah slept peacefully, Josiah took Alara's hands. They were chapped from the cold and hard work, but to him they were beautiful. "You saved her, Alara," he said, his voice thick. "You saved us all. I was a fool to ever doubt." He couldn't finish, his throat tight. Alara's heart swelled. This quiet, stoic man, who measured his words as carefully as his dwindling supplies, was laying his soul bare. "We saved each other, Josiah," she replied softly. Word of Slocum's thwarted attempt and Alara's role in it, coupled with Sarah's miraculous recovery, slowly trickled into Redemption Gulch. Slocum tried to paint himself as a concerned neighbor checking on them, but the story, when Josiah quietly recounted it to a few trusted men, had the ring of truth. The town's perception of Alara began to shift. Martha Higgins still offered only curt nods, but some of the other women, those who had once tittered behind their hands, now met Alara's gaze with a hesitant respect. Clarabelle, notably, was silent. A few weeks later, as the first green shoots of spring pushed through the thawing earth, a traveling preacher passed through the area. Josiah, with a quiet gravity, asked Alara if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, truly and formally. Their wedding was simple, held in the small cabin with only Sarah, her face beaming, as their witness. Alara wore her best dress, the mended dark wool, and Josiah wore a clean flannel shirt. He placed a simple, hand-carved wooden ring on her finger. There were no bells, no cheering crowds, just the quiet solemnity of their vows, witnessed by the vast prairie and the equally vast hope blooming in their hearts. The Thorn homestead began to feel less like a place of struggle and more like a sanctuary. Laughter, once a stranger, now echoed within its walls, especially Sarah's, who trailed Alara like a devoted shadow. Alara taught her to bake, to sew, to identify the prairie flowers that bloomed with surprising tenacity. Josiah, though still a man of few words, now sought Ilara's counsel, his eyes often finding hers across the supper table with an expression of quiet contentment and a love that needed no grand pronouncements. Ilara still had gray hair, more silver now perhaps, glinting in the prairie sun. It was no longer a mark of derision, but a testament to her journey, her resilience. She was no longer just the mail-order bride who was mocked. She was Ilara Thorne, wife, mother, a woman who had faced down hardship and prejudice, and had, against all odds, found her redemption not in the name of a dusty town, but in the steadfast love of a family forged in the heart of an unforgiving land. She had found her home and her worth, not in the eyes of others, but deep within herself, and reflected in the loving gaze of those she cherished. The prairie wind still blew, sometimes harsh, sometimes gentle, but now it whispered a song of quiet triumph. If Ilara's story of resilience and finding love against the odds resonated with you, please consider liking this video, subscribing for more tales of courage, and sharing your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, strength and beauty come in many forms, and it's never too late for a new beginning.